Hi, I've done my research on the cultural impediments to Nebuchadnezzar's repentance, and one of the questions that I want to answer is what were some of the significant hurdles to the Babylonian king becoming the man of that we see in Daniel chapter 4 of publicly acknowledging God as the true God. And I don't aim to be a Nebuchadnezzar sympathizer. I want to highlight that God bringing Nebuchadnezzar to the place that he did of repentance and humility was truly as impossible as it gets. And I just want to highlight all of the obstacles that were present throughout his entire life that would have made it seem very, very, very unlikely for him to acknowledge God. And I want to do this because if we only recognize Nebuchadnezzar as being opposed to God because he was a prideful man, or maybe he was a cruel man, or he was unhinged, it doesn't do justice to show that truly nothing is too hard for our God. So in Daniel chapters 1 through 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar characterized many different ways. So some of the things that he did: he pillaged Jerusalem, its temple, he exiled residents, he blinded Zedekiah, he ordered wise men to be killed from his own people, and he threw Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, into the furnace. He definitely was a man on his own program, but he was still used as an instrument of God's judgment. So we see him as being a maniac, a murderer, erratic, and then throughout the book, as well as obviously at the end, we see him be as agreeable, humble, and sincere. And some of the things that took place to get him from point A to point B were, of course, Daniel reiterating and then explaining and interpreting his dream to him that God gave Daniel the ability to do. And then also, of course, we see Nebuchadnezzar be subject to an illness that leads him to live in the wilderness for 7 years, away from people, away from his kingdom. And those things that happened definitely brought him to become repentant and to be humble. But it's not a transition from him being a bad person to him then being a good person, and that makes him acknowledge God, because humans are complex and multiple things can be true about a person. Not that truth is relative, and of course he was a prideful man, but whether all of those bad things or not were true, the issue of why it took him so long to come to acknowledge God as the only God, I think, is more going from polytheism to going to an understanding of having a one true God. I think this was his actual transition, that his actual character progression. So to understand someone, you have to go back and understand their family. His family is most likely from a town called Uruk, which was either the southernmost part of Babylon or a little bit beneath Babylon. It's where cylinder seals originated, and that was one of the first ways that people were able to outwardly recognize their autonomy by the stamps. And also, throughout his family, a lot of people have similar names, so it shows that family was important to them. They had honor among their family, and they respected one another. So, directly preceding Nebuchadnezzar was his father, Nabopolassar. And at the time that Nabopolassar positioned himself as the king, Babylon had gone through more than a century being ruled by the Assyrians. And they had been unsuccessful in all their rebellions. So when Nabopolassar was successful and became the king of Babylon, this would have been a huge success, and it would have been a huge deal that they were a newly independent state that had a local king. So he began building projects, he began restoring various other projects throughout Babylon that had been destroyed over time or due to war and due to civil war. And he actually identified himself as being a devotee of Nabu and Marduk, which were both Babylonian gods. They were ancient Mesopotamian gods. So Nabopolassar actually left behind one of these cylinders, and in the cylinder, I want to read a piece from the end of the cylinder. He says, any king at any time, whether a son or a grandson, who will succeed me, and whose name Marduk will call to sovereignty over the kingdom, do not be concerned with acts of might and power. Seek the sanctuaries of Nabu and Marduk, and let them slaughter your enemies. The Lord Marduk examines pronouncements and examines the heart. The one who is loyal to Bel, his foundations will endure. So in the cylinder, he acknowledges his gods, but he also emphasizes that they're incredibly important to him, that without them, he wouldn't be much. In the beginning of the cylinder, he actually identified himself as a son of nobody, whose rise to the kingship was due to his faithfulness to his gods. Obviously, to say he was a nobody was an exaggeration, but he seemingly devoted his entire life to the worship and the progression of his gods. Now, to Nebuchadnezzar himself, his father died shortly after taking the kingship, so they would have still been very fresh off of the newly found independence. So the kingship was at this time directly related to the gods. It was seen as being a position that was fulfilled and sustained by the Mesopotamian gods. And that being said, Nebuchadnezzar would have been extremely devoted to his gods. He would have been very familiar with, he would have ascribed to, and he would have executed the Code of Hammurabi, which was a code of laws that they were obeying at the time. Hammurabi was an ancient Babylonian king centuries before him and his father. So this is a picture of a copy of the code, and then the sculptures is Hammurabi depicting himself as receiving these laws from one of his gods, Shamash, most likely, and acknowledging him. So Nebuchadnezzar would have been tasked with being the judge over and upholding these laws, which also the code recognizes that the kingship and the gods are directly in relation to each other, that the king is nothing without the gods, and that the king should protect the honor of the people and serve the gods. Another evidence that Nebuchadnezzar was extremely devoted to his gods was the existence of the Akitu festival. So it happened once a year in the spring, and it began with a procession that included the king and members of his courts that would have walked along the processional way, which is this picture at the top with the Ishtar gate, the blue gate. And then what would happen? This went on for 12 days, but one of the events, maybe one of the most important events of the festival, was the king would kneel before the priest, and the priest would then slap him. The priest would slap the king very hard, and it was understood that if the king shed a tear, then the gods approved of him, and only if he shed a tear could he then go on and serve as king for another year. And this was a way of humbling the kings and of course acknowledging again that they don't do things apart from their gods, which Nebuchadnezzar would have been subject to yearly. And then another huge part of Nebuchadnezzar's life was construction. And I want to read a quote from a book, Theologies, Priests, and Worship in Ancient Mesopotamia. And it says, "The only purpose for the state, even in its earliest manifestations, the justifications for its survival, was to shelter, maintain, and serve the gods." Nebuchadnezzar, being an very ambitious builder, would have had so much honor, and he would have had so much pride in building up the names of his gods and representing them really to the world, because the cities and the gods were directly related to each other. Every god at this time had a resident city, so of course the more built up the city was, the more powerful and the better reputation that city's resident god would have. And Babylon at the time of Nebuchadnezzar's reign was an absolutely insane built up city, which I want to show some artist renderings of what the city could have looked like due to that they understand from excavations and such. So the temples were housed within each city, and The temple was a place where that God lived, that God was fed, that God was worshipped, that God was cared for. And at this time, the kings and also all of the servants of the gods understood that their God needed to be taken care of by humans. So a lot of what Nebuchadnezzar would have done at the time, he would have thought is helping his gods. And I want to read from Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Surely your God," to Daniel, he says, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." So Nebuchadnezzar is able, before coming to actually acknowledge God, he's able to acknowledge that God is real and that he's powerful. Even he says he's the God of gods and the Lord of kings. It's very difficult for him to understand that God is the only God, that none of the other gods are true. Of course, having had been raised in the society that he was raised in, where his identity was directly related to his gods. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, which means Nabu, protect. And Nabu was one of his gods. This is another rendering of what the Hanging Gardens could have looked like, which Nebuchadnezzar is reported to have been responsible for building. So after Nebuchadnezzar is able to understand that Daniel's God is real and that he's powerful, he still has an issue with acknowledging him as the only God, and turning from the gods that he knows and that he's very committed to. So then we have the incidents of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refusing to acknowledge whatever deity it is that Nebuchadnezzar has erected, and then of course they're punished by him by being thrown into the furnace. Of course they survive, but Nebuchadnezzar would have been very offended that they would not acknowledge his gods, especially because of his commitment, his complete identity in them. And it also would have been hard to understand because I can imagine he must have thought it's okay, like everybody can have their gods, and we still see that today. And Nebuchadnezzar is just a great example of why that world understanding is so difficult to overcome. So as having viewed himself as a representative of his gods, it would have been really a direct offense to him and then, of course, to his gods. So he punished them, and after he saw them survive, he still had to he went through another dream. He had to be subject to the time in the wilderness, and they seem like such extreme things, but knowing of his culture and knowing of his society and knowing of his place in that society, it is just an absolute miracle that God was able to completely change him into the man that we read about in Daniel chapter 4. And in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar says, "For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will, among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?'" And in conclusion, our God is an awesome God, and he is able to do anything. Nothing is too hard for him. And Nebuchadnezzar is just such a great example of that. That is really exciting to study, and it's a really a place of hope when we look in the world and we see things that are seem impossible, that seem like they will never turn around.